So, boleh ya?
Okay, boleh, dah live.
All right. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin. Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ladies and gentlemen, do you hear the echoes? I hear the echoes. Ustias, I hear the echoes. Hello? Dr. Syed Mustafa, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay. So maybe we can start again. So let me welcome all of you to this session. Actually, this program is part of Istac lecture series. I think this is the 7th lecture series that we organize throughout the year. And I would like to welcome everyone here in this session. I would like to welcome the speaker, that is Dr. Syed Mustafa Ali. Let me introduce the subject and also the speaker. So the topic of our discussion today is decolonizing computing. The question that would be discussed by Dr. Syed Mustafa Ali, does computing needs to be decolonized? And if so, how should such decolonization be effected? I think this is very, very interesting question because it's somewhat of a stretch to describe computing as a colonial, especially seeing colonialism as a phenomenon tied up with the imperial structure of domination and settlement is a thing of the past. So how can computing be colonial if the age of empire is over and we live in the post-colonial world? So I think this is a very interesting question that Dr. Syed Mustafa Ali is going to talk about. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce the speaker today. That is Dr. Syed Mustafa Ali. He is a lecturer and convener of the Critical Information Studies CIS Research Group in the School of Computing and Communication at the Open Universities. And his transdisciplinary research focuses on developing a hermeneutic framework grounded in Heideggerian phenomenology, critical race theory, and post-colonial decolonial thought, and using this framework to explore how race, religion, politics, and ethics are entangled with various technological and more specifically ICT phenomena. So in this connection, he has published work in the area of decolonial computing and algorithmic racism. This is also a very interesting term, interrogating trends and post-humanism that is called big data and internet governance. So, you know, as somebody who is not in the field, I think this is very, very amazing, very interesting subject of discussion. So without any further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Syed Mustafa Ali to start the conversation. Please, you're welcome.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. maybe I should just begin before I launch into the talk. And the talk is actually a prepared paper, which I'm going to read with accompanying slides just to drive the presentation. Maybe I should begin by expressing and extending thanks to Professor Imtiaz Yusuf for the kind invitation, reaching out to me to present this material, and in particular to present this at Istac. Istac has quite an important place for me insofar as its founder, Syed Muhammad Naqib Al-Attas, his work, in particular the 1978 work, Islam and Secularism, was really quite instrumental in assisting me to develop another area of thought which emerged at the same time as this project. And just by way of genealogy to what I'm going to present this evening, in 2014, I was invited to give a series of seminars in Granada, and I was given a free hand, and I decided to propose something called Islamic Decoloniality. So this was like, if you like, an Islamic take on what decolonization, more specifically what the decolonization of knowledge and related terrains would entail. And one of the sources that I drew upon was Al-Attas's work from 1978, Islam and Secularism, in particular chapter 3, where he has a very interesting take on Deen, which resonated quite strongly with me. But in the same year, and just a few months later, I attended the Critical Muslim Studies Summer School in Granada. And it was in the context of a roundtable discussion that I presented to fellow participants and colleagues there my proposal for attempting to apply decolonial thought in the context of computing and ICT. So this is a very opportune moment for me to be presenting this material to an institution in the global south, an international institution, and as I said, one, at least the founder of whom I have a lot of resonance and respect for his thought and its continued impact on my own in this cognate discipline of Islamic decoloniality, which I'm not going to be talking about today. Today, I'm talking about, well, decolonizing computing, question mark. But hopefully, perhaps in a future setting, there'll be an opportunity to explore that other side of the work that took off in the same time period, 2014. Now, since 2014, when I floated this idea in a very short extended conference paper, I've gone on to develop that in an invited paper which appeared in Crossroads, which is an IEEE magazine for students. And again in 2018, in an extended book chapter looking at decolonization in relation to the issue of internet governance. But my thinking has continued, hopefully, to develop, and you can determine that for yourselves after hearing the talk. And I keep returning back to the question of what it might mean to decolonize computing. And inshallah, that's what I'm going to present now. So I'm just going to try to share my screen. And if somebody can just confirm that is happening. Okay, I'm assuming you can all see the screen, which is the title of the lecture. Excellent, thank you. Decolonizing Computing, open parenthesis, question mark, close parenthesis. It's a question. Okay, let me begin. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Intentionally ambiguous, I suggest the title of my talk provokes a cluster of questions. If the question mark is ignored, decolonizing computing arguably points to an activity, that is, subjecting computing to a process of decolonization. Beyond the question concerning the meaning of computing, something that has preoccupied me in the past, various other questions present themselves, including the following. What does it mean to decolonize computing? Who is carrying out this activity? Where is this activity being carried out? How is this activity being carried out? And why is this activity being carried out? And of course, we need to appreciate that these questions prompt a set of further complementary questions once we reframe them in normative terms, that is, in terms of should or ought. Beyond these questions, there is also the question as to whether this activity is underway, and if not, whether it should be underway. Of course, all of this presumes that such an activity can be carried out, an issue I shall return to later in the talk. Yet the activity of decolonizing computing presumes something else, something prior, viz., that computing is, in some sense, colonial. However, and as our facilitator has previously mentioned, isn't it somewhat of a stretch to describe computing as colonial, especially since colonialism, as a phenomenon tied up with imperial structures of domination and settlement, is a thing of the past? How can computing be colonial if the age of empires is over and we live in a post-colonial world? In what follows, I will attempt to sketch something along the lines of a grand narrative for thinking about computing in relation to the decolonization project, from a perspective informed by phenomenology, critical race theory, and decolonial thought. To better motivate my argument, I need to begin by setting out the meaning of a few terms, viz., the world, colonialism, computing, and the relationship between them. I then go on to explain what is and what is not, or should not be, meant by decolonization and decoloniality, briefly set out the project of decolonial computing, and offer two different answers to the question, can computing be decolonized? Concluding by briefly outlining what is perhaps a rather radical stance to contemporary developments within computing and cognate phenomena. Let me turn now to set out the first of my terms, the world. One possible point of departure is the sociological and phenomenological account presented by Berger and Luckman, wherein a world is a socially constructed reality in which people find themselves and which they shape through various kinds of action, both individual and collective. On this view, world refers to the interrelated totality of things, both natural and artifactual, which in the contemporary so-called information era includes computing and information and communication technology, or ICT systems, network infrastructure, and various technical institutions and governing bodies responsible for their maintenance and regulation. However, it is important to appreciate that this way of thinking about world tends to obscure certain fundamental considerations relating to the site and operation of power and its role in bringing forth such a reality, that is, constituting the ontology or way of being of a world. In this connection, the concept of world proposed by philosopher and decolonial theorist Enrique Dussel in his Philosophy of Liberation from 1985 offers something in the way of a useful corrective. On his view, world is an instrumental totality of sense. It is not merely an external aggregate of beings, but the totality of the beings that are meaningful to me. The world is thus the system of all systems that have humankind as their foundation. The everyday world, the obvious one that we live in each day, is a totality in time and space. Crucially, Dussel goes on to state that, and I quote, as a temporal totality, the world is a retention of the past, a launching site for the fundamental undertakings projected into the future, and the stage on which we live out the present possibilities that depend on that future. As a spatial totality, the world always situates the I, the person, the subject, at its center. From this center, beings are organized spatially from the closest ones with the most meaning to the ones furthest away with the least meaning. In other words, peripheral beings. Dussel's conception of world and his framing of it in terms of a spatial temporal totality, or rather a geographical historical matrix, within which are embedded differentially situated subjects, viz. Those at the center or core, and those at the margins or periphery, is useful insofar as it points to the existence of a historically shaped and futurally oriented background horizon against which both human beings and various humanly constructed things, that is, objects, processes, events, etc., and artifactual systems need to be positioned in order to make sense of them. Insofar as worlds come into being through the actions of differently positioned actors exercising differential power, critical inquiry necessitates subjecting worlds to interrogation with a view to understanding the becoming or coming into being of their embedding systemic natures. In the contemporary context, I suggest that this requires us to excavate the origins of the modern world system and its political ontology, which I shall attempt to do, albeit briefly, from a perspective informed by critical race theory and decolonial thought. However, before moving on, it is important to note in passing the tendency to bracket consideration of the phenomenon of world making within computing, which is the focus of this talk, in terms of the historical grounds of this process. On this basis, some commentators such as Connolly argue that computing belongs within the social sciences, although I tend to think that it is better situated at the intersection of various disciplines, including but not limited to the social sciences. Turning now to colonialism, a phenomenon which I need to treat at some length. According to seminal world systems theorist Immanuel Wallerstein, the history of the modern world system has been in large part a history of the expansion of European states and peoples into the rest of the world, commencing with the so-called Columbian voyages of discovery in 1492 of the Common Era, which resulted in the emergence of a capitalist world economy. To better understand the nature of this expansionist project, two other terms require unpacking: colonization and colonialism. Colonization, from the Latin colere, or to inhabit, refers to an ongoing process of control by which a central system of power dominates surrounding lands and their resources, people, animals, etc., through a process of settlement, that is, the establishment of a colony. Colonialism, by contrast, refers to the establishment, exploitation, maintenance, acquisition, and expansion of a colony in one territory by a political power from another territory. Crucially, it involves a set of unequal relationships between the colonial power and the colony, and between the colonists or colonizers and the indigenous population or colonized. We might summarize the difference by saying that colonization tends to refer to expansionist migration. For example, to settle colonies in America or Australia, the establishment of trading posts and plantations, etc. While colonialism covers this situation along with the ruling of the existing indigenous peoples of the so-called new territories. In its modern form, colonization involved the spread of tens of millions of Europeans around the world, so much so that in many settled colonies, European settlers formed a large majority of the population. Such settlement involved both expropriation of land, labor, materials, and knowledges, and the genocide of indigenous peoples and enslavement of others, specifically Africans. The modern colonial project commenced with the voyages of the Spanish and Portuguese empires in the late 15th century, which were later augmented by other European imperial adventures: French, Dutch, British, and Danish in the 17th century, and German and Belgian in the 18th century. According to post-colonial theorist Anya Lumba, by the 1930s, and I quote, European colonies and ex-colonies covered 84.6% of the land surface of the globe, end quote. An important, arguably categorical difference between European colonialism and classical or pre-modern colonialism is that, according to Wallerstein, European colonialism brought forth a world system constituted by a European core and non-European periphery, the modern world of global capitalism marked by an ensemble of sociocultural norms, attitudes, and practices that can be traced to Renaissance and Enlightenment developments within Europe, and which culminated in a commitment to liberalism as the legitimizing political philosophy of dominant states within an emergent interstate system. Yet while liberalism might be the defining self-narrative of modernity, it must be reiterated that colonialism is its dark, occluded, obscured underside, and it's a constituted underside. In short, there is no modernity without colonialism. Furthermore, and crucially, European colonialism, in contrast to earlier forms of colonialism, was a project with religious come racial foundations, insofar as there was a constituted entanglement of colonialism with processes of racialization, that is, heritable, taxonomic, exclusionary race construction. The latter functioning as a non-reductive organizing principle in the violent forging of the binary, hierarchical, world systemic structural opposition of the West and the rest during the longue durée of the 16th century and thereafter. Yet while centering 1492 and race as organizational principle in relation to the formation of the modern colonial world, I suggest the need to contest the rather pervasive and uncritical embrace of the secularization thesis, viz., the inevitability of the transition from religion to reason and latterly to science. A transformation whose occurrence has been called into question on empirical, ethical, and theoretical grounds by various scholars, including the anthropologist Talal Asad. On this basis, and with a view to correcting the secularist tendency within decolonial theory, in which the world is framed in de-godded terms, thereby obscuring the theological nature of race as a persistent phenomenon, rather than as a mere phase within the history of racialization, I argue for the need to adopt a position along the post-secular lines offered by Jed Hickman. On this alternative decolonial reading, rather than conceptualizing colonial modernity in terms of a passage from a religious to a secular ordering of the world, it should be understood in terms of political theological remapping and a globalizing shift from a transcendent cosmological order to an increasingly immanent sphere of the planetary. Crucially, I suggest this move has precedent within decolonial scholarship itself. Consider in this connection Lewis Gordon's argument for thinking about race as a creation of the Theodosian grammar of the world, David Theo Goldberg's conception of race as the work of anthropic gods, and Sherman Jackson's reference to white supremacy as the work of second creators, all of which point to whiteness as attempting to occupy what might be described as the God spot. Following Hickman, I maintain that shifting from a secular to a post-secular frame is important, since it enables us to refocus our decolonial lens and the attendant set of categories we use to interrogate the modern colonial world, thereby allowing us to better appreciate continuity through change and what might be described as the hauntological presence of the past. In this connection, and in terms of the contribution of antecedent historical phenomena that informed the colonial enterprise, and whose structuring logics were embedded in the constitution of the modern colonial world system, building on the work of Slovenian historian Tomaž Masnak and others, I maintain that the anti-Islamicate foundation of the Crusades, commencing in 1095 of the Common Era, stands out as of perhaps decisive significance vis-a-vis its role in Christian polity formation, that is, the emergence of Christendom, come Europe, come the West. While decolonial scholars rightly point to the colonial moment of the longue durée of the 16th century, inaugurated by the fall of Granada in 1492, and the commencement of the Eurocentrically framed voyages of discovery as initiating indigenous genocide, systemizing anti-Black racism, and bringing the modern colonial world into being along structurally hierarchical lines, the phenomenon of structural systemic anti-Islamism dates back much earlier, arguably to the launch of the Crusades. As Abbas Hamdani stated in 1979, and I quote, "The year 1492 is an important milestone, yet its birth in a medieval crusading milieu is most often underrated, if not totally forgotten," end quote. I suggest that while decolonial scholars such as Nelson Maldonado Torres have not forgotten the crusading milieu, they have underrated its importance vis-a-vis thinking about modernity coloniality, and that this underrating is due to a mistaken conception of the paradigmatic relationship between Christendom and Islamdom, that is, the spatial political abode of the Islamicate. Here I draw attention to the need to think about the significance of the Crusades vis-a-vis the Muslim threat, whether real and/or imagined, and their entanglement with events involved in shaping the contours of the religio-racial logic emerging within the context of the so-called New World voyages. In this connection, consider how anti-Islamism functions in and as a background discursive horizon, informing the very terms of debates that were arguably of decisive significance in the emergent construction of race, such as that which took place at Valladolid in Spain during 1550 to 1551, between Bartolomé de las Casas and Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda. According to Tomás Masnac, for both Sepúlveda and Las Casas, and I quote, "The Turk functioned as an organizing principle in the internal economy of their natural, philosophical, and theological reasoning, structuring their responses to the problem of the humanity of the New World Indians," end quote. European identity having been forged in antagonistic opposition to what was known as the Imago Turki, or the image of the Turk. Elsewhere, I have suggested that this has genealogical significance for what I refer to as the decolonial question concerning artificial intelligence. Briefly, and developing the argument of Dylan Mahendran, who pioneered work in this area, AI and cognate developments such as machine-come-deep learning are grounded in computation. The latter is grounded in rationality, and both are situated in opposition to race along the line of the human. Yet what mediates the shift from that which is the bearer of a rational soul created in the imago Dei, the image of God, if you like, to the rationally embodied imago hominis, or man, is the imago Turki, the image of the Turk, a largely occluded figure within decolonial accounts. Those interested in exploring the details of this argument further are invited to check out the closing keynote I delivered at Cambridge Muslim College in 2019 with the title, "The Decolonial Question Concerning Artificial Intelligence," accompanying slides for which I have made available on my academia page. But returning to the Crusades, Masnac maintains that its significance cannot be overemphasized. On his view, which is worth quoting at length, "As an ideal and as a movement, the Crusades had a deep, crucial influence on the formation of Western civilization, shaping culture, ideas, and institutions. The Crusades set a model for expansionist campaigns against non-Europeans and non-Christians in all parts of the world. The ideas, iconography, and discourse associated with the Crusades made a profound imprint on all Christian thinking about sacred violence, and exercised influence long after the end of actual crusading. They continued to play a prominent role in European politics and political imagination. In fact, the crusading spirit has survived through modernity well into our own postmodern age," end of quote. In short, the Crusades provided a template for later imperial colonial ventures, including those taking place within the contemporary technocentric modern colonial world order. Crucially, in this connection, historian David F. Noble argues that technology has been deployed within Western Christian history as a means by which to combat the apocalyptic figure of the Antichrist, the latter being identified on various occasions as a Muslim. This is significant because Christopher Columbus, who launched the European colonial project, styled himself as a messianic figure committed to liberating Jerusalem from the infidels. On this basis, I suggest that there is a need to consider the entanglement of race, religion, technology, and power in relation to the formation of modernity, coloniality, an entanglement that persists in the contemporary post-colonial era and informs the development of various technological phenomena. Now, colonialism as a project of European political domination involving settlement formally ended with the national liberation and independence, or decolonization, movements of the 1960s. Yet the modernity which colonialism engendered persists, albeit transformed, under the condition of postmodernity, which has meant the persistence of certain sedimented colonial ways of knowing and being, that is, colonial epistemology and ontology, based on systems of categorization, classification, and taxonomization, and the embedding of these in practices, artifacts, and technologies. It is these legacy systemic structuring logics, ontological, epistemological, cultural, political, economic, what is referred to as coloniality, which persist in the contemporary post-colonial era, notwithstanding the formal end of colonialism, that I suggest need to be considered in relation to the question concerning whether computing is colonial. So much for the world and its entanglement with colonialism. What of computing? As to the nature, that is, the essence, or if you like, whatness of computing, philosophically speaking, my position continues to be at least partially informed by the phenomenological worldview advanced by computer and cognitive scientist Brian Cantwell Smith, as set out in his 1996 work on the origin of objects, where he states, computation is not a distinct or autonomous subject matter, but is instead a complex practice involving the design, construction, maintenance, and use of intentional systems. By an intentional system, Cantwell Smith refers to a system characterized by a certain directedness, which, following the philosopher Martin Heidegger, he conceives in terms of instrumentality, that is, readiness to hand, or if you like, toolness, and availability for use in achieving something. My own focus on computing, rather than the arguably more abstract phenomenon of computation, is informed by the view that computing is a more encompassing phenomenon, and importantly, that it must be understood as socio-technical in nature. If this understanding of computing is correct, it follows that any attempt at extracting a purely technical or computational component from its entangled assemblage with people should be viewed with a measure of suspicion. Furthermore, I suggest that computing should be seen as entangled with a cluster of historical processes, including cyberneticization, computerization, informationalization, digitalization, and more recently, datafication and algorithmization, and associated with the development and deployment of networked digital computing and ICT phenomena such as mobile, wearable, social, cloud, embedded, that is ubiquitous and pervasive, smart, and machine-come-deep learning technologies, importantly, in increasingly convergent configuration. In this connection, I suggest that such convergence points to a datified and algorithmized intensification of the cybernetic turn of the 1950s, rather than its displacement by something else, thereby indicating continuity through change. While recognizing that the history of computing, like other histories, is a contested terrain, and duly acknowledging the entanglement of history with geography, and both with power, it is a fact that computers, programming, artificial intelligence, the internet, and ICTs all emerged in the West, primarily Britain and the United States, against a backdrop of inter-European military conflict, World War II, and post-war ideological conflict, the Cold War, both of which were relationally entangled with colonized populations along the global color line. As to the relationship between the world, colonialism, and computing, and with reference to the specifically racialized nature of European colonialism, I suggest that this relationship is usefully understood in terms of what I refer to as algorithmic racism otherwise, a conceptual framework in which historical shifts in racialization processes are interpreted as programmatic or procedural. On this reading, computing should be seen as the latest iteration in the relational logic of algorithmic racism, a technoscientific refinement for purposes of maintaining modern colonial world systemic hegemony under contestation. Thus, I suggest that the histories and geographies of computing and colonialism are entangled insofar as the origins of computing are tied to European, Western imperial projects and militarized, industrialized contexts whose legacy system effects persist in the contemporary post-colonial era. In this connection, consider, for example, resource extraction in the Congo, which has gone on for centuries and which continues to power the global north, commencing with the extraction of copper for computing systems during the Cold War, and more recently, cobalt for lithium-ion batteries and coltan for mobile devices. Tracking supply chains and the operating logic of racial capitalism affords us an insight into the coloniality of computing as resources, patterns of consumption, and the production of waste, which creates circuits involving the core and periphery of the world system. And here I draw on the seminal work of Nathan Ensmenger. In short, I want to suggest that computing, at least in its hegemonic or dominant form, is colonial in some sense because as a modern phenomenon, it is founded upon and continues to embody aspects of colonialism, specifically the structural and facilitating logics of coloniality. Going further, I maintain that computing has become if not the primary means by which the racialized colonial project has perpetuated itself in the post-colonial age. With a view to making more concrete what some of you might feel is, thus far, a rather historical and abstract theoretical argument, allow me to present some examples of what is often referred to as algorithmic bias, demonstrated by widely available technologies, apps if you like, incorporating machine learning and/or artificial intelligence. Google's photo app, which resulted in Black people being classified and tagged as gorillas, a problem which remains unfixed. Hewlett-Packard's face tracking software, which can track white faces but not Black ones. Smart soap dispensers that will dispense soap to white hands but not Black ones. The Zoom app, which was unable to recognize the head of a Black man as a head. The Grammarly app, which classified the text in a Black man's essay as angry because it was focused on Black food history. The ExamSoft face recognition technology, which required a Black woman to shine bright, that is white light, into her face in order to prove that she is not cheating. Face recognition technology in the UK automated passport checker, which is a problem with the faces of dark-skinned Black females. Google's photo app, again, which returns pornography when searching for Arab or Russian or Ethiopian girl in the Zionist settler colonial state of Israel. Gender switching in Google Translate as one translates to and from certain languages. Microsoft's Tay, an AI chatbot, which was released via Twitter in 2016, and which proceeded to generate racist, sexist, and anti-Semitic pro-genocide messages. And more recently, a co-authored paper by Abid Farouqi and Zul, which explored persistent anti-Muslim bias in GPT-3, a state-of-the-art contextual language model. And the list goes on and on and on. Examples such as these have led some commentators to argue that there is a blind spot in AI research, while with others inviting us to consider AI's dark side, which has been framed as, and I quote, a white guy problem. One attempt at addressing such concerns has been to focus on issues of fairness, accountability, and transparency in machine learning, with diversity, inclusivity in both development teams and training data being suggested as means by which to effect a solution to the problem of bias in AI systems. However, I and others have questioned the ultimate value of such approaches. For example, in the context of discussing facial recognition and face classification technology, legal scholar Frank Pasquale has pointed to the problem of inclusiveness and diversity vis-a-vis the structurally oppressive surveillance and policing function of the former, that is, face recognition, and scientifically racist nature of the latter, that is, face classification technologies, suggesting that what might be required is their ban rather than fix, irrespective of whether such attempts are made at effecting the latter through technological or socio-technical means. In this connection, and by way of an Islamophobic example, it was disturbing to note a BBC News item from last year reporting on a claim by a software engineer that a camera system using AI and facial recognition intended to reveal states of emotion was tested on Uyghur people in the Xinjiang province. Now, while the above examples were drawn from machine learning and AI, and I consider focusing on AI and machine learning warranted, given that various commentators have suggested it is likely to be the dominant technology in the near future, given it offers what some have referred to as a GPT, or general purpose technology, it's crucial to appreciate that coloniality is arguably operative within other areas of computing, including ubiquitous computing and robotics, human-computer interaction, and internet governance, some of which I have written about in my own work. In addition, it is imperative to note that many of the big five tech corporations, that is GAFAM, or Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft, have entanglements with settler colonial projects such as the Zionist State of Israel, providing the latter with computing infrastructure for purposes of surveillance, policing, and enhanced militarized violence. For details, I should like to point interested parties to the important investigative journalism of Yard and Katz reported in Mondo Vice, as well as to the work by sociologist Michael Quet as reported in The Intercept and elsewhere. In fact, and as I will discuss shortly, GAFAM is arguably rolling out a colonial project of global proportions, although one that plays out quite differently depending who one is and where one is located. Put simply, datafication and algorithmization present biopolitical, that is, social ordering concerns for those living in the former core of the modern colonial world system, while it is a matter of necropolitics, or crudely, killability for those dying in its peripheries. Let me turn now to the matter of decolonization and the project of decoloniality. Perhaps the single most important thing to take away from this discussion in relation to decolonization is that, as Tuck and Yang argued in 2012, rightly in my opinion, and forcefully, it is not a metaphor, and that any attempt to frame decolonization in metaphorical terms should be subjected to critique on account of the actual as opposed to merely possible violence involved in such a move vis-a-vis those who continue to endure the legacy systemic effects of the colonial project. While it is beyond the scope of this presentation to engage this issue, I suggest it looms large in the context of recent discussions of digital colonialism and data colonialism in both global North and global South contexts. Related to decolonization is decoloniality, which refers to a critical, that is, power relational orientation emerging in the colonies and ex-colonies of the world system. One way of thinking about decoloniality is as a transdisciplinary horizon which foregrounds race as the organizing principle in a system of entangled structural hierarchies, that is, asymmetric power relationships. Decolonial thought tends to focus on epistemological concerns, that is, the production of knowledge and who counts as a knower, although this should not be understood to preclude considerations of ontological concerns, specifically what it means to be human, who counts as human, and who gets to determine this. Crucially, the decolonial orientation requires us to think about the geopolitics, or where, and body politics, or who, of knowledge production, and prioritizes the marginalized knowledge of those located at the margins, the borders, the peripheries of the modern colonial world system. Decoloniality is informed by two entangled commitments. The first being more epistemological in nature, and the second more explicitly ethical, yet both further entangled with ontological and power relational concerns, viz. 1. an epistemological commitment to embrace the decolonial turn, which involves what Walter Mignolo, a decolonial theorist, has referred to as delinking. That is, decentering of Eurocentrism, West-centrism, North-centrism, as the preeminent site of knowledge production, and two, embrace of the decolonial option, which involves a preferential option toward those situated in the margins, peripheries of the modern colonial world system, with a view to effecting reparations and compensation, and thereby seeking redress for the ongoing legacy systemic effect of colonialism. According to media theorists Nick Couldry and Ulysses Mejias, and I quote, decoloniality is not simply decolonization, defined as the end of colonial occupation and administration, but a broader rethinking of relations to ongoing coloniality, end of quote. I suggest that this characterization of decoloniality is useful in the context of engaging with computing along critical, that is, oppositional ethical political lines, insofar as it speaks to my own project of decolonial computing as concerned less with how to do computing in the periphery and more with disclosing what computing means in relation to the ongoing operation of colonial logics in the contemporary era. But let me turn now to the question concerning the decolonization of computing. In short, can computing be decolonized? In my view, there are basically two ways of thinking about this, one of which leads to the more optimistic answer, yes, in response to the question, can computing be decolonized? The other to a somewhat more qualified and perhaps more pessimistic rejoinder, viz., yes, computing can be decolonized, but it won't be, at least not anytime soon. Let me begin by attempting to make the case for the more optimistic answer. Philosophically speaking, if computing stands in a historically contingent relationship to colonialism, then it is, at least in principle, possible to delink, that is, detach or disarticulate computing from its entanglement with coloniality. And proposals such as post-colonial and latterly decolonial computing seek to effect such delinking. In this connection, Ron Eglash, who's based at the University of Michigan, Ron Eglash's work in ethnocomputing, generative computing, and the development of culturally situated design tools are all examples of how decolonial computing might be done along more positive lines. By decolonial computing, and this is my take on the topic, I refer to the interrogation of computing and related ICT phenomena from a perspective informed by critical race theory and decolonial thought, where the latter is held to foreground considerations of the body politics or who and geopolitics of, or where of knowing and being. Decolonial computing turns about a preferential option for thinking through conceptual frameworks emerging from the periphery, the margins, and the borders of the modern colonial world system, with a view, once again, to effecting compensatory and reparational action vis-a-vis the legacy systemic effects of historical colonialism persisting in the post-colonial era. Researchers and practitioners adopting a decolonial computing perspective are required, at a minimum, to do the following. Firstly, consider their geopolitical and body political orientation when designing, building, researching, or theorizing about computing and ICT phenomena. And secondly, embrace the decolonial option as a political ethical stance, attempting to think through and think what it might mean to design and build and govern computing and IT systems with and for those situated at the peripheries of the world system, informed by the ways of thinking and knowing, that is the epistemologies, located at such sites, with a view to undermining the asymmetry of local global power relationships. Let me turn now to the more pessimistic position, viz., computing can be decolonized, but it won't be, at least not anytime soon. In this connection, Paula Chakrabarty and Mara Mills in 2018 provided a very useful point of departure, and I quote, "If computing technology is the embodiment of rational calculation and a driver of 21st century capitalism, can it indeed be decolonized, overhauled, or appropriated for other ends?" End of quote. I want to suggest that even if the relationship between computing and coloniality is historically contingent, in its dominant or hegemonic contemporary form, computing does not merely carry the legacy systemic traces of colonialism, but is fundamentally driven by a relentless colonizing logic. In this connection, human-computer interaction theorists and practitioners Paul Dorish and Scott Mainwaring have argued that ubiquitous computing is characterized by a pervasive and expansionist colonial impulse. While endorsing this view, I suggest that this colonial impulse is far more deeply embedded in the broader expansionist thrust of computing, associated with the transformation of the modern world through incessant computerization, latterly digitalization, and more recently datafication, and the rise of a purportedly global information society. For example, concomitant with developments in network social computing has been the rise of what some commentators have referred to as surveillance capitalism. This is the idea of Shoshana Zuboff, and data colonialism, which is the work of Caldrian Mahias, pursued by GAFAM and other tech corporations. The extraction and datafication of human behavioral surplus or data waste, generated through interaction with digital technologies for purposes of generating saleable prediction products, and perhaps more importantly, biopolitical governance, if not for necropolitical ends. While there are certain problems with the framing of data colonialism, at least on my view, insofar as it tends to center both data and capitalism, while somewhat obscuring the arguably more encompassing phenomenon of digital colonialism, not to mention the intrinsic entanglement of Western capitalism with racism, racialization. I concur with these commentators that the colonizing imperative associated with data extraction will only be intensified by the rollout of what is referred to as the Internet of Things, which Russell et al. In 2018 described as follows: envisaging a global infrastructure in which physical objects are coupled with embedded ubiquitous computing facilities and virtual representations within an electronic network, allowing for new forms of intelligent interaction between these objects, the physical world increasingly populated and penetrated by smart objects turns into an exponentially expanding address space for computerized networks, so much so that it is argued we have reached a planetary scale of computation. In this connection, I suggest that one useful way of thinking about the entanglement of extant surveillance capitalism and surveillance capitalism, data colonialism, even digital colonialism, with the proposed development and rollout of the Internet of Things is in terms of a shift from boots on the ground settler colonialism to bits in the ground, or perhaps bits from the ground settler colonialism as effected by digital proxy. While opposition to digital and/or data colonialism is emerging in both the global north and global south, it tends to be framed in terms of national and grassroots calls for data ownership, localization, and sovereignty. Largely absent from such proposals are questions concerning the desirability of the relentless drive for datafication associated with digitalization, its entanglement with neoliberal developmentalism, the seductive and addictive power of digital technologies, and the socio-political and economic costs of withdrawing from them. This has led at least one commentator to suggest that there is a process underway and one that just might be too late to reverse. For science and technology scholar Paul Edwards, a Borgian, and here he's drawing on Star Trek The Next Generation for all the tech nerds out there, a Borgian assimilation of the human life world effected by algorithmic infrastructuration has occurred. This bleak, I would suggest dystopian scenario, only gets bleaker when we consider the environmental and ecological costs of this project under industrialized racial capitalism, with its commitments to growth, extractivism, and accumulation. Resistance to such algorithmization might appear to be futile, but it must be attempted regardless. How should the colonizing tendency of the algorithmic be resisted? By way of conclusion, and in light of this dystopian pessimistic scenario, I should like to briefly present a couple of radical answers to the question, what should be done? One view, advocated by those subscribing to an abolitionist stance, is to attempt to roll back on such infrastructural developments, to undo that which has been done as a precursor to doing otherwise. Grounded in the African-come-Black experience of transatlantic slavery and its legacy systemic afterlives, the abolitionist orientation towards the colonizing imperative of computing focuses on the pursuit of freedom from surveillant and carceral anti-Blackness as it manifests in a variety of technological assemblages associated with predictive policing, recidivism, differential access to healthcare, schooling, housing, etc. While acknowledging the importance of this orientation, which requires us to consider the persistence of the past in structural terms, I suggest the need to complement this with another more presentist orientation, focusing on preventing that which is in the process of being done. In short, interfering with the project of infrastructuration as it is underway. Grounded in the historical precedent of 19th century Luddite opposition to machinery harmful to the commonality, yet reorienting the commonality along decolonial lines, and with a fugitive commitment to keeping silent about that which cannot, should not be spoken, that is, made public, this position entails a commitment to intervention, including destructive and possibly violent social material intervention, with a view to preventing the totalizing digital colonization of the life world. I cannot emphasize enough that the Luddite opposition was to specific machinery perceived as causing hurt or harm to the commonality, and not to technology per se. While some commentators have argued that the latter should be understood in terms of the commons, others have interpreted it in terms of the maintenance of a way of life. Either way, what is focal is harm or hurt, and the attempt to intervene in the contingent, concrete, present, with a view to preventing such harm, rather than acquiescing to it as an unfortunate yet necessary corollary of bringing about an abstract future framed as beneficial by hegemonic power. Yet why continue to advocate for some variant of Luddism in the contemporary era of digitalization, datafication, algorithmization, and AI, when other options are on the table and available, including regulation? For my part, legislation and regulation are non-starters, since ineffective for advancing decolonization, given the clear and present dangers and continued exercise of veto powers and enactment of the state of exception by powerful actors within the world system. More problematically, legislation and regulation arguably function as means by which to defer, that is, postpone and distract from decolonization efforts. In this way, witness continued UN failure to gain international agreement and a treaty banning the development and deployment of lethal autonomous weapon systems, so-called laws. What a horrendous acronym. Technologies which have already been used against those among the wretched of the earth, specifically certain Muslim populations. In this connection, and as a brief aside, it was disturbing to note a UN report stating that a Cargill rotary wing attack drone loitering munition system incorporating machine learning and real-time image processing and manufactured by the STM Defense Company of Turkey was used in Libya in March 2020. This is apparently the first battlefield deployment of a lethal autonomous weapon system. The UN report states that, and I quote, "The lethal autonomous weapon systems were programmed to attack targets without requiring data connectivity between the operator and the munition. in effect, a true fire, forget, and find capability, which refers to a weapon that once fired can guide itself to its target. But again, why Luddism? According to Kevin Robbins and Frank Webster, and I'm quoting from 1999, we still need Luddites to question the possibilities that technological change offers. Luddism continues, in fact, to be a necessary force in the new global society, and it is alive and flourishing. Technological modernization still feels itself being stalked by its other. Yet this stalking other, the hauntological is the hauntological spectre of Luddism. Yet I suggest the need to consider a potentially far more threatening othered other to technological modernization, which comes to haunt the latter once its dark, warring, colonial underside is revealed, viz. The defiant oppositional spectre of a decolonial Luddism. That is, a Luddism driven by those located at the periphery of the modern colonial world system and aimed at resisting the rollout of specific technologies unfolding in the present. A fortiori, those that through technological momentum become sedimented as colonizing infrastructure of a nature and at a scale radically distinct from the machinery targeted by historical Luddite actions. Luddism is further enhanced, I suggest, by the tactical embrace of a fugitive orientation towards the colonizing drive underpinning datafication algorithmization associated with surveillance capitalism, data colonialism, and extractivist AI. And by fugitivity, I refer to a position informed by a range of currents, including the historical experience of Black slaves in the US attempting to escape, some of whom formed maroon communities, escaping from plantations during the transatlantic slave trade, a fugitive orientation that Black commentators argue remains in place given the persistence of the surveillance and carceral or containing anti-Black logic of white supremacy. In addition, there is the fugitive or outlaw status of the historical Luddites themselves and others such as pirates to consider. I suggest that both strands, fugitive Black slave and outlaw white Luddite, can be seen to be entangled when the issue of property is brought into focus. The Luddite being in the main a destroyer of property, the destruction of machines, the slave attempting to disavow the status of being turned into property. Having sketched out the contours of what I mean by fugitive decolonial Luddism, let me offer two possible sites of intervention. The first targets the physical network infrastructure that underpins datafication and algorithmization and involves disruption, which can be effected in various ways, including network disassembly, hacking, misinformation, anonymization, and whistleblowing. The second targets datafication itself. Insofar as data sets can be strewed as a form of property, and insofar as this datafied property is extracted from persons and places, various possibilities beyond legislation and regulation suggest themselves, ranging from informed refusal, the counterpart to informed consent, based on a strategy of disobedient, non-compliant, and non-conformist disavowal, opt-out, withdrawal, non-participation, and weaponizing of exclusion, to calls for the outright abolition of big data in subaltern contexts. In The Costs of Connection, How Data is Colonizing Human Life and Appropriating It for Capitalism, which appeared in 2019, Nick Caudry and Ulysses Mejias maintained that, and this is very interesting, and I quote, "One day, a fatwa against a social media company may come along, and people will take it as a battle cry. Maybe whole communities will start to feel that particular platforms are no longer for them," end of quote. Yet given contemporary realities and the momentum, trajectory, and confluence of surveillance capitalism, data colonialism, AI, machine learning, and the proposed development and rollout of the Internet of Things, I am inclined to the view that the battle cry, arguably a cry to jihad or struggle, should focus less on specific platforms and social media and instead target the colonizing infrastructure of computing itself. Recently, in connection with the climate crisis precipitated by fossil fuel extraction, Marxist professor of ecology, Andreas Malm, invited us to consider how to blow up a pipeline. In the context of the vulnerabilities, if not crisis and/or existential threat, engendered by extractivist datafication and algorithmization, I am therefore led to ask, at least rhetorically, how to drone strike a server farm, contemplating the necessity of engaging in the destruction of hegemonic technological infrastructure or decolonial computing as guerrilla warfare and sabotage to facilitate the transition to a more generative, that is non-extractive, political, economic, and socio-technical reality. Apocalyptic science fiction? Time and the fire that rises will tell. Yet if the longer durée of history has anything to teach us, it is that when the machine launches its crusades, the wretched of the earth respond with jihad. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Syed Mustafa Ali. It is very, very excellent presentation. I really enjoyed, and I would say I was amazed actually by the analysis made by you. It's very, very powerful, as the Malaysators say. And here we have a lot of questions actually from the participant or audience tonight. And I think that you can see the question on the right side. I think I go straight to the question. I do not have any comments. And let us start by addressing a question raised by Jannah Al-Jafri, who said that we still can see the effect of British colonialism today, how our society to many extent are still organized on racial lines. And then maybe I can read through, and then we you can respond to that after that. From Abu Alamgir, who say, my question is that with the dominance of English language worldwide, we are less likely to learn each other's language like Arabic, Persian, Urdu, etc. Do you think English, being the lingua franca, takes away knowledge from the Muslim world? This is also very, very interesting question. And from Professor Abdul Aziz Barghouth, he said, having articulated the concept of colonial digitization in a broad framework, in your own opinion, do you see any role of spirituality, ethics, and values in dealing with this phenomenon? Any practical suggestion? I think that we limit discussion only 3, and I will allow you to respond to that, and we proceed to the next. You're welcome, Dr. Syed Mustafa.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. So I think if I'm right, I need to respond to Jannah Al-Jafri's question first, maybe, or try to respond. And I'm going to try to keep my comments short, which will be a first, perhaps, but there you go. So we can see the effects of British colonialism today, how our society, to many extent, are still organized on racial lines. Well, this is my argument that colonialism has an afterlife. If you like, it continues to haunt the post-colonial. Sometimes there's this misunderstanding that post-colonialism is to be thought about in a kind of temporal sense, that like there was colonialism and then colonialism ended and now we're in the post-colonial era. That is not how post-colonial theorists, and certainly not how decolonial theorists, think about the post-colonial era in which we find ourselves. Rather, this is about the continued presence of if you like, the structuring and organizational principles, logics, understandings, worldviews, commitments, etc., that have their origin in the colonial project, but that persist after formal decolonization has ended. That means, so-called national independence, etc. So, I mean, in the context, maybe this is coming from the specific context of the Malay archipelago. So, what has happened in Malaysia, what has happened in Indonesia, etc. I think it is absolutely the case that you will continue to see the effects of British colonialism, because the decolonization project remains underway. I mean, there's various arguments about this, but to some extent, it was either suspended, or some say aborted. It's been picked up again. I'm delighted to report back. Various people are attempting to pick up the baton, as it were, and advance the project. And to some extent, that is what the decolonial project is about. It's like literally picking up the baton from the anti-colonial struggle. The decolonization struggle was anti-colonial at that time, and rethinking what that project means in the contemporary era. So, I mean, I said this was going to be a short answer, but I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, yeah, absolutely, the structuring logics of racism and racialization process, of course, they're going to persist in the contemporary moment, because the decolonization project is ongoing in the context of a world that continues to bear the traces of colonialism. If I can jump forward, I guess the next question was from Abu Alim here. He raises this question. I mean, we interact in various forums, and I'm delighted to see that he's actually raising this question, because I'm just briefly, this is my maybe underinformed position on this, but there are arguments being made that maybe English has now become one of the languages of the Islamic age. And the argument for that is that it has been adopted by so many Muslims, I mean, including those in the Western diaspora, if you like, diasporic Muslims located in the West, but also those in the more, if you like, historical Islamic lands. So whether that's India, Pakistan, Africa, etc. And so, one could argue that, yeah, that there is a sense in which the lingua franca of the day, and it's very interesting that we say lingua franca, we don't say lingua arabica. So the very terminology itself bears the trace of kind of, if you like, European hegemony in some sense. One could argue that, yes, this might mean the marginalization of Arabic, Persian, Urdu, Bangla, Malay, etc. But you could also take the alternative view and say, well, we're actually going to co-opt English and fold that into the terrain of the Islamic age. I mean, I'm sure that's probably not the kind of satisfying answer that Abu Alam is looking for. I mean, maybe he might want to come back on that. I'm quite happy to hear a counter response. Would you like to come in? I think you're on mute. Oh, you're being muted. Okay. Oh, have you made a comment below?
Thank you, Syed, for your answer. I think there's advantages, like you're saying, there's advantages and disadvantages. I mean, it's good that we have a language that different Muslim countries, peoples from different Muslim countries communicate in a common language. But I also think that it's worthwhile to learn some of the big languages of the Muslim world, like Arabic and Persian, and to go back to some of the, it helps us go back to some of the earlier works as well. Puts us, gives us a grounding. But, you gave a really good answer, Syed. Thanks.
Can you hear me okay?
Go ahead.
My bad. Apologies.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're quite right. I just take the view that maybe, and this is a kind of an idea. It's nothing profound, but an idea that I often think about is what I call conceptual bilingualism. That we need to understand the language of white supremacy, if you like, or the dominant modern colonial, let's call it lingua franca. But we also need to understand resistant languages of the colonized. So, I mean, if you're making an argument for something like that, absolutely. I mean, I just don't think I could argue against that, specifically because, as you rightly point out, if we cut ourselves off from our tradition and heritage, we fall, it's like nature abhors a vacuum. Well, so does culture. So does, if you want to use the term, civilization. And if we jettison our own pre-modern, pre-colonial, whether you want to call it Muslim or global South or whatever heritages, that void has to be filled with something. And I mean, it clearly has, given that so many of us have colonized minds, bodies, souls, etc. I hope that answers your question. Well, that's my attempt at answering your question anyway. But yeah, I mean, and I know you're a person who's learning multiple languages, so mashallah, may Allah strengthen you and assist you to learn more and more and more and enrich the ummah. If I may, I think the next question was from, is it Abdulaziz Berg? Is that right?
Yeah, Abdulaziz Berg was our dean at Istac. Yes, please.
Oh, okay. So I really like this question. I mean, not that I don't like the other questions. I like all the questions. So having articulated the concept of colonial digitalization in a broad framework, in your own opinion, do you see any role of spirituality, ethics, and values in dealing with this phenomenon? It might not be apparent, and that's why maybe at the very start of this talk, I talked about kind of two strands of decolonial work that I've done or attempted to do. One is what I presented today, which is in decolonial computing. The other one is in Islamic decoloniality. And this is where, I mean, for me, principally, the Quran and, if you like, our spiritual traditions, in particular for me, tasawwuf, and a particular strain of tasawwuf, which continue to inform my thinking about Islamic decoloniality, is what I call weaponized tasawwuf. So this is the tasawwuf that engenders khalwa into the ribat with a view to bursting forth to do this kind of fugitive decolonial Luddite intervention work that I mentioned. So it's not this kind of quietist politics. It's a spiritually informed project, which is fundamentally about confronting what I see as the dominant manifestation of Taghut in the contemporary age, this technocentric paradigm of algorithmization and datafication. So for me, I mean, this might not have been clear in my presentation, but underpinning all of this, underpinning the jihad that I suggested in the last minutes of my talk, is a commitment to ethics, to values, to spirituality, underpinning this oppositional project. I hope that answers his question. Are there any other questions? I'd like to take as many questions as possible, and I'm happy to stay on the call for as long as people are happy to stay on the call.
Yes, there is more question coming in. I think another question coming from Dr. Imtiaz, asking about, my question is, today Islamophobic forces like Hindutva and others are using computing, social media to oppose the Muslim around the world. What do you think of it? What's your take on this? Yeah.
Well, I don't think much of it. I think it's a disaster. But it's a disaster which I think is just in the nature of things. If the argument I presented has any traction, then I think it's, there's a colonizing impulse I'm suggesting within social media, within datafication, within algorithmization, within the Internet of Things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just so obvious that actors that want to impose hegemony, even if it's regional hegemony, are going to mobilize these technologies to enhance their projects. So entanglements of the Chinese state with, anti-Uyghur phenomena, entanglements of the settler colonial Zionist state of Israel with, for example, corporations like Microsoft, India's Hindutva mobilizing computing technology, social media, and other infrastructure for purposes of mass data collection, biopolitical ordering, and necropolitical killing of Muslims and other subalternized others. I think it's just, for me, it's just like, them reaching for the technology of the day. In terms of what, maybe by Imtiaz's question, what to think of it? Well, that's what I think about it in terms of that's the reality on the ground, at least as I understand it. In terms of what to do about it, jihad. Jihad is what to do about it. Jihad is always what to do about it. There is the argument for appealing to institutions like the United Nations, regulation, intervention, etc. But, the history of that institution in terms of, coming to the aid of the wretched of the earth does not bode well. So I'm suggesting that we need a more pessimistic reading of current realities to prompt a sense of urgency so that we actually step up, rise to the challenge, rather than resting our laurels and saying, don't worry, in the grand scheme of things, the long arc of history bends towards that which is good and hope and everything. Well, of course, I mean, the entirety of the cosmos and everything within it is within the grip of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But, you know, that doesn't mean that we just passively do nothing. Yeah, I mean, trust in Allah, but tie up your camel. Trust in Allah and destroy the machines.
Okay. Sir, we have another question from Jana Al-Jafri. I think it's very, very interesting question. You can have a look at it, Dr. Mustafa.
Yeah. Okay, I'll just read the question out so that others can hear it, and I can hear it myself.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting. And as a practitioner, and not very academic myself, I learned a lot. Jazakallah khair for that comment. I'm struck by the bit you shared by Fanon from 1961, that decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. Indeed. Technology, particularly the internet and mobile devices, can also be a positive force, enabling more people, including those in the periphery, I guess, to participate and contribute. Yes, I concede that. So in a way, that's undoing some of the effects of colonialism. Because geography matters less, and access to vast amounts of knowledge can be a click away. What else do you see needs to happen to take the undoing further, practically speaking? Although, as you say, we have been assimilated and probably no way back, we are still able to shape the future. Absolutely. So I'm hoping that my reference to Luddism as a spiritually informed jihad orientation goes some way towards answering that. Of course, I concede that technology has, in quotes, positive benefits. I mean, we're having this conversation through Zoom. I'm located in North London in England. There are people on the call. I mean, I can see at least one brother who's from the States, and you know, there are other people probably from Malaysia and elsewhere. So let's, you know, I mean, for me, this, and at the risk of, you know, being rather, you know, blunt about this, this is just a given. But that is often how colonialism masks itself. We have to, I think we need to ask the more troubling question, which is this technology that we are using to have this call, to have this discussion, to have this conversation. Was this developed for us, by us? Do we own it? Do we control it? Or are we, as it were, accidental beneficiaries in some sense? And also, insofar as we use these platforms, to what extent are we folded into the colonial project? Because all the data that we generate is being harvested, extracted for purposes of refining the technological project even further. So, of course, for example, the Luddites used hammers. Hammers are technologies. They broke machines. And we can hack and use technological means, whether that's, you know, an understanding of the protocols governing the, you know, internet infrastructure, or various programming paradigms to be able to hack, jam, or even engage in, dare I say, cyber attacks. You know, that could be contemplated as a means by which to effect a pushback against the colonizing project. And this isn't, you know, sometimes, you know, critics say, well, look, you know, this is ridiculous. People are anti-modern, yet they're using the tools of modernity. So there's a contradiction here. There is no contradiction. There never is a contradiction. You're using the tools to dismantle the system. It's an internal critique motivated by something which is from outside of the paradigm with a view to imploding the paradigm. So yes, we can connect. Yes, we should continue to connect. Yes, we should make use of this technology to have these conversations. But inshallah, let's keep our eyes on the bigger prize and understand who are the prize winners, because it's certainly not us, at least not right now.
And I would add, actually, by having this kind of conversation, it would open our eyes more, and I think that we can take back our destiny from being shaped by others. We have another question actually coming from Sumaya, I think. Yes, Sumaya here asks, could you please give some information about reliability of academic or database study in today's world, where most of the basic work based on online resources? In fact, many academic studies are therefore monopolized by major publishers connected to the same or at least a similar source. As of nowadays, at what level is the accessibility of truthful academic information within info pollutions?
Okay, I mean, yeah. So, I mean, the way I'm interpreting this question is this is something to do with what's referred to as network effects within if you like, digitalized spaces. So if you think about it, an item of information, let's say, is a node in a network, and another item is another node in the network, et cetera, and you've got multiple nodes being connected. But it's not a flat network in the sense that everything is connected to everything. No, some nodes are more connected than others, and we might call those nodes hubs. And if you think about it in something like the long tail phenomenon, you've got a winner-takes-all kind of phenomenon. So the early entrants into the field, those who have, if you like, differential power, are able to establish their visibility relative to others, and everything then clusters to them. It's what's known as the Matthew effect, or to them that already have, more shall be given. And that's the logic of networks. That is the structure of all network phenomena, including the internet itself, to a large extent, and certainly social media phenomena, which are driven by this logic. So in terms of, which is called information pollution, I guess maybe she's pointing in the direction of things like filter bubbles, echo chambers, so-called fake news, and this kind of phenomena. I mean, I think we just need to educate ourselves about that and be aware of this. I mean, I have a paper. It's a book chapter, incredibly long. I mean, anyone who reads it, mashallah, more power to you. It's called Prolegomena to the Decolonization of Internet Governance. It's about 70, 80 pages long. And I try to explore in the implications of network effects in various computational phenomena, including the internet itself and social media. And, that might be one possible resource for, where the struggle is taking place. However, we also, need to understand the nature of that terrain. So, I'm not suggesting mine is the best resource, but equipping ourselves with an understanding of things like network effects, preferential attachment of nodes in networks, filter bubbles, echo chambers, fake news, etc. It can only be for good.
This is very thought-provoking subject. That's why we have a lot of questions here. We have more, actually. Now,
bring it on.
Yeah. Okay, and Norlisa Francis, who is asking you to repeat the recommendation or share the summary of the slide. I think for the takeaway, she said. The recommendation, I think, maybe because you share the slide, but she cannot see it.
Okay, well, I can summarize the slide. I mean, Professor Andreas Malm asks us how to blow up a pipeline. So I paraphrase and say, well, okay, how to drone strike a server farm. So the takeaway there is and just for the record, this is a rhetorical argument.
Yes.
At least for now. But I'm trying to present, as I said, a kind of grand narrative and maybe a thought experiment to think through the implications of what I'm calling a colonizing project in the sphere of technology, specifically computing. My understanding is that this is being recorded and it's going to be hosted on YouTube as well. So, I mean, if it's okay, the sister can grab the slide if she likes later on from YouTube, rather than me firing up again. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
She can, yeah, okay. So we have another question from Nur Azlina Muhammad Noor. She said that the loss of proficiency in our Malay Jawi writing system through colonialism has definitely severed the connection to our traditional Islamic knowledge. And she also continued asking another question. We see our youth being preoccupied with e-gaming. And to what extent is e-gaming affected by colonization? What's your take on that, Doctor?
My question is, subhanAllah, the range of questions is expanding and expanding and expanding. I'm not an expert in the area of gamification and, its impacts. What I do see, because I have colleagues at my institution who occasionally, to everyone's ping, they offer a pong to, as it were, bat back criticism of game playing, because there's often what might be described as rather conspiratorial or alarmist interpretations of gaming. That, well, no, it doesn't have an effect on, neural wiring of the youth. It doesn't lead to more violent dispositions, etc., etc. For my part, although I don't have a very clear definitive position on this, I'm of the largely of the inclination that all phenomena that we engage with at length are likely to have some kind of neurological imprinting effect. I think that's just in the nature of, engagement with the phenomenal world. So if your phenomena is gaming and your gaming is violent, then it's likely, whether that is conscious or whether it's, it goes into the subconscious, the preconscious, or whatever, I think it is likely to have some kind of effect. Whatever that effect is, I don't entirely know. I would defer to the expertise of others. It's not something I've explored myself. What I would say though is I guess I'm, and maybe this is a very obvious and rather boring point, but it is kind of disturbing when you see maybe Muslims playing games like, I think it's Call of Duty or something, because I've never played any of these games, where you're shooting up Muslims, you're blowing up masajid, and it's the wretched of the earth, non-white people, specifically Muslims in this instance, I think, who are the targets attacked by the good guys, which is largely, I guess, Western American forces and kind of their colonizing allies, as it were. I think that's disturbing. At a minimum, I think it's Islamophobic and disturbing. But beyond that, just the sheer amount of time invested in gaming is kind of disturbing when, there's a world arguably that's on fire, whether you're thinking in terms of climate change, whether you're thinking in terms of what I've described or attempted to argue for here, which is the colonizing impact of the rollout of this technology, or more importantly, the confluence of these developments. The world is on fire and people are gaming. Subhanallah. I mean, again, get real. Literally get real. Don't get artificially real. Don't get virtually real. Get real.
Okay, so we have a question from Malik, I think from Malik Zaiter. I think it is better that you ask the question yourself, Brother Malik, please. You raise your hands there. Are you going to do that? Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, yes.
Thank you. Dr. Mustafa, I loved your presentation. I love your work. Jazakallah khair. I was wondering about any examples of this digital jihad. For example, I was thinking of, I agree with you that some people will criticize you about, we're using Zoom to do this, so it seems contradictory. I agree with your point, but I think that there's a solution in the middle that you could have mentioned. If you agree, I would love your comment on that, which is seeking alternatives, because there are many alternatives that have been emerging, especially since 2013 with the Snowden leaks, that are really interesting, like Signal instead of WhatsApp, Jitsi instead of Zoom, etc., etc. So maybe one example could be the promotion of open source software, but also zero trust software, which I'm sure you're aware of that. Like it's technology that's designed for you not to need any trust in the manufacturer, let's say, to ensure the privacy of your communications. So one last thing I would say is that I feel there is a disaster that I've seen, given that I'm a big enthusiast of privacy, is indifference in our societies and our communities to privacy. We have nothing to hide, all these arguments. And when I send, for example, my university who are using the Google servers for their emails, and I send them an email, probably sounding like a crazy student, maybe we should seek other servers, other email providers. Why are we depending on Google? I am met with complete indifference, if not mockery, by the university and by my colleagues. I would love to hear from you about that.
Jazakallah khair for that, Malik. I think you've nailed it. And maybe I should just say I agree, with the caveat that developments like open source, I think are slightly, well, at least I would suggest they need to be approached with some measure of critical skepticism for one reason, if not for more, and that is for their co-optation by dominant power. So often there's arguments for saying, well, the alternative to proprietary and corporate platforms, software, services, etc., is to make them open source. Yes, but to some extent, this is exactly what corporations want to see happen, because then they can just, launch in and fold it into their own projects. And they are much more able and much more ready to do that and much more able to do that because of the various forms of capital that they have, including human resources in terms of coders, in terms of data gatherers, data analysts, data mining technologies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the only thing I would maybe offer to what you're saying is the caveat, to be cautious about developments like open source. But I absolutely agree with you, and I do want to make this point extremely clear to participants on this call, that decolonial computing doesn't primarily speak to the kind of issues that I've been trying to present in this presentation today. Decolonial computing is largely about computing done at the borders, at the margins, at the peripheries. So it is this other kind of technological development that I think Malik is referring to. And yeah, I'm not suggesting that shouldn't happen. It's just that that's not where my attention is focused. I should have maybe said this right at the outset. I adopt a stance which I could describe as methodological dystopianism. So I am interested in the worst case possible scenario and the implications of that, and in terms of what is required to effect an effective response to that worst case scenario. So as a methodological dystopian, I want to be wrong. I want people to say, well, look, the apocalypse didn't happen. It isn't Armageddon. Everything's fine. We solved it through regulation and mitigation and arbitration, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But my response right now is, I'm intervening right now. And what if the momentum, the trajectory, the orientation of hegemonic computing continues as it is? How do we respond to that? And that's why all the developments that Malik is referring to, I suggest more power to them. They need to continue. And I'll leave that for others to get on with, people who are better equipped to do that work than I am. I want to develop this worst case dystopian, if not apocalyptic scenario, and run with it to see what might be required to affect a different and better future, inshallah.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Doctor. Now we have move on to the next question by Malik Ilyas. You can see the question, Doctor?
Yeah, I can. Okay. What measures would you advise adolescents to take control of their data footprint? Can you also please explain that hacking is not a criminal activity as such by enhancing one's coding skills? Sure. Right. So this is a kind of interesting question, because I'm hoping that I addressed some of them in relation to taking control of data footprint. There are things like informed refusal, that I'm not going to surrender my data, et cetera, et cetera. I mentioned some of them at the tail end of the talk. I don't know if Malik heard that part of the talk, but towards the end of the talk, there are various proposals. The problem I suggest is that there is something about this technology which is incredibly seductive. So much so that these huge, what are known as EULAs, E-U-L-A, end user license agreements, they just scroll on forever. You scroll all the way down. Have you read the end user license agreement in order to sign up to this app? Of course not. You just click I accept and you're in, you're away. No one's going to read that. And I would suggest, and maybe a slightly conspiratorial reading, that they are that long so that no one reads them. But the devil is in the details, always. And there's a seduction associated with a technology that is highly usable, just point and click. I mean, this idea of like holding a gadget, I mean, you can't see this. I think you can't see this, no, but I'm actually holding a smartphone, and this kind of like pouting and posing, this kind of hyper narcissism associated with some of these technologies, it is so diffuse. It's completely transcultural. It's global. And, when you kind of like point this out to people, it's like, that's really boring. I don't want to hear that. I just, this thing allows me to, point and click. I can send this to my mom. I can send this to my friends. It's a photo of my dad. Have you seen that photo of that cat playing the piano, et cetera, et cetera? And it gets more and more and more banal. So I think that, I mean, and maybe this is just an artifact of the fact that I'm approaching my mid-50s. So maybe I have become an old man. But I just think there is something of, dare I say, a kind of generational phenomenon and a loss of a kind of critical oppositional orientation. I mean, I understand this in some contexts, but in my opinion, for Muslims to lose a critical oppositional orientation, it just staggers me. But hey, I mean, this problem is global. So, I mean, why wouldn't Muslims get caught up in this? So, I mean, there are ways to take control of their data footprint, but the question, I think, Malik, is, are they going to do it? We could make present a series of options, but are they going to do it? I suggest no, they're not. They're just not going to do it because it's boring. It interferes with, their peer relations. It interferes with the dominant culture, which is one of speed, hyperpresence. I would suggest a narcissistic drive to be seen, etc., etc. Can you also please explain that hacking is not a criminal activity as such, but enhancing one's coding skills? Well, that's true, because cracking is the criminal activity. But when we use terms like criminal, we have to open up that whole debate about the terrain of the legal and who gets to define that, and criminal relative to what. So it's a language game. So at the risk of playing critical theory as a response, I really do think we need to problematize what we mean by crime. I mean, Noam Chomsky has this quote from St. Augustine at the beginning of his book, Pirates and Emperors, that, pirates been ravaging the seas, and finally, and he's been ravaging the empire's fleet, etc. And finally, the emperor catches the pirate and says, "How dare you do this? How dare you ravage, my fleets and the wares that I'm carrying?" And the pirate turns around and says, "Well, when you ravage the seas, that's empire. But when I ravage the seas, it's piracy." So it's all, again, the devil's in the details. In here, it's in linguistic details. It's in the conceptual terrain. It's in the language. And that's why, at the risk of playing language games, I really do think we need to kind of problematize literally everything when it comes to this discussion.
Wow. Okay, thank you very much. Now we go to Mira Katiwi. Yes.
This is another really nice question.
Yeah.
Would you like to ask your question, sister? Maybe I can attempt a response.
Yeah, because
yes, go ahead.
I've been going from communities to communities, and I know the challenges that these issues actually comes when we want to translate these issues to larger communities. We cannot go with the term decolonizations or decolonizations. I think that's too heavy for the public, right? So values actually would be an easier way to sort of translate this. Like, for example, as much as we know that issues with data, issues with all those kind of things are serious, but when we look at the instruments at home or at school, we are still allowing this to actually happen. It's like, for example, our kids are sort of obliged to actually accept friend requests from strangers, and yet we are giving them a message that you shouldn't talk with strangers. But when it comes to online friendship, it's allowed. It doesn't make sense. So we have two different sets of values that we are not really well integrated in terms of how this should be the same. And I'm having a hard time to actually bring these narratives to communities. So unless we have kind of a consensus on this and more efforts actually put in, I think it will be a long, long way to go in terms of decolonizing technology. And after all, I put always the easiest way to actually put these narratives to the communities is by giving the analogy of a knife, that it's the tools, but you have to make sure that you put in values and knowledge to this, because it can actually hurt, or otherwise you can actually master the tools and you can bring values to the ummah. So that's the easiest way to actually get through, but I know that's not enough. So, and working alone will not be enough either. Yeah.
I would add, Dr. Mustafa, is riding the wave of technology rather than fighting with them.
Okay. Well, I'm really happy for that question, because I want to push back against that. So first of all, and I mean, I think that values are not going to do it. And unfortunately, the whole, if you like, Islamization project, which was absolutely saturated with an obsession with values and epistemology, etc. I would suggest it's done next to nothing in terms of confronting the rollout of this hegemonic project. It's almost like it's taking place on the sidelines and irrelevance, as it were. So I hopefully with due respect to the questioner, I really think we need to get real. Again, I've said this a number of times, we need to get real. We need to accept that colonialism, its logic, continues to operate in the present post-colonial moment. And whether it's heavy or light or somewhere in between, this discourse needs to be brought to the people, whether they are kicking and screaming, whether they are drowning in it, whether it's too much for them. They have no choice. They have to confront this. This is part of the nature of the struggle. That's the first point. The second point, which I think, and I really like the fact that you've invoked the analogy with the knife, because this is where I think we need to ask a really serious question about the datafication, algorithmization, and Internet of Things project as an expanding project. And remember, it wasn't me who said this. It was Russell and et al. From 2018 said, we have reached the scale, or we are reaching the scale of, and I quote, planetary level computation. Okay, so don't shoot the messenger. They said it, and I'm just repeating what they've said. Now, if that is true, it means the scale of the project is not the scale of a kitchen knife. I would suggest it's something like the scale of an atomic bomb. In fact, bigger than an atomic bomb, because even an atomic bomb doesn't devastate the entire planet, although multiple bombs could potentially devastate the entire planet. So this is the real question. Is datafication, algorithmization, surveillance capitalism, et cetera, all the cognates, is the analogy of that project, those developments, better understood in terms of a knife, which can be used to, butter bread, or as a stabbing weapon? Are those developments better understood as a knife, or are they better understood as something like a nuclear weapon, or let's say a bioweapon that rolls out in pandemic proportions to eliminate entire populations? I mean, this is the question. Are we dealing with a knife, or are we dealing with a pandemic? How should we think about these developments? And this is where I would actually invite people to go away and read a brilliant essay, which is an extended essay into a small book by Ivan Illich from, I think, 1973, which is called Tools for Conviviality. And I take away 3 points from Illich. We need to think about balance, we need to think about limits, and we need to think about scale. And a fortiori, we need to think about those 3 things in relation to the colonizing impulse of technology. So with due respect to the questioner, I don't think that using the analogy of a knife is going to do the work, but using the analogy of a bioweapon or rampaging, drone, sky weapons, or lethal autonomous weapon systems, or if you want killer robots, although that's a very contentious area, that's a much better model for what's going on here. But I'm not even engaged with those specifically. I'm interested in what happens when the computational fabric becomes infrastructure in the same way that, for example, we have the water system as part of our infrastructure, the same way we have the electrical grid as part of our infrastructure, the same way that we had the telegraph come various other forms of communication cabling as part of our infrastructure. What happens when AI becomes part of the infrastructure? And remember, something is an infrastructure if there are human dependencies on the continued existence of that technology.
Yes, it's very, we have to be very careful as well with the use of metaphor. Sometimes it could be misleading, right? It is because knife, the computing is bigger than the knife, or more, pervasive than that.
Sorry, can I just comment on that? Because I don't mean to undermine the problem. It's just that I think we have to understand, especially when you are talking to the communities, and yet, for example, you are talking to schools, and then you are bringing these narratives, and yet schools are forced to actually teach technology as part of the curriculum. I think we have to really, I mean, like in Quran, we have to speak the language of the people, right? So in this case, how you bring these big problems to the person who have like basically no ideas about the issues, the global issues that you are referring to. I think for all of us, we can relate better, but for kids.
Yeah, but okay. Sorry for intervening. I think the quick answer to that is yes, of course. قولوا قولا سديدا, speak words straight to the point. Yeah, and we should communicate in the language of the people. But the language of the people is not static. If we educate the people, we can increase their languages. I mean, we had a brother on the call earlier, Abu Alam Gheer, who was talking about, well, what about Arabic? What about Urdu? What about Bangla, etc., etc. These various languages. Aren't they at the risk of being marginalized because of English? And I said, well, yes and no, because English could become one of the languages of the Islamic Age. I would suggest that we're dealing largely with Islamic Age phenomena in this conversation, at least to some extent. And I'm speaking English. I'm not fluent in other languages. I know some Arabic. I don't know my father's language, which was Urdu, but I hope that I'm speaking in Islamic Age language and talking to Muslims through the medium of English. So these shouldn't be seen as, if you like, static spaces. If there's a problem with the curriculum, change the curriculum, clean it up, improve it. But the most important thing is to have a curriculum that is fit for purpose, that is oriented to doing the work that needs to be done. And first of all, I think, and I don't know if I've made the case sufficiently well or whether people are not convinced by the case. I mean, these are largely a rhetorical, endeavor. But if people are persuaded by the narrative I'm presenting, then it's like, okay, I need to go away and transform things. So whatever area you're working in as an educator, transform it, transform the pedagogy, transform the content, transform the curriculum, enculture the people, become embedded in the community so that their language expands.
Yeah, we have actually 3 or 4 more questions, but I'm not sure we still have a time because I was given the mandate until 10:30. So we have a question from Muhammad Shazani Masri. Do you think by revisiting Messianic discourse in the Abrahamic tradition could play a constructive role in presenting a comprehensive worldview about the state of global techno dystopia today? Your take.
This is another great question, mashallah. So, I mean, I have friends, and one of my friends, he actually said to me some years back, so, just come on, be straight up, are you committed to a messianic apocalyptic view? And I said, well, yes and no. Yes, I am, because like I mentioned earlier, I'm committed to what I call conceptual bilingualism. So I believe that the dominant system in the world today, you can call it colonial modernity, white supremacy, whatever you want to call it, racial capitalism, etc. I believe that it's underpinned by a political theology which actually is apocalyptic and messianic. That's what, that's the understanding that I've come to. So I believe you have to take the apocalyptic seriously. Am I apocalyptic in my own orientation? Am I waiting for the Mahdi? No, I am not. So I don't have that kind of orientation. But I kind of follow, I mean, it's interesting that there's a book by, I think maybe he was a literary theorist, Norman O. Brown, called The Apocalypse of Islam. I think that was the title of the book. It's got a very interesting study in there of Surah Al-Kahf, the 18th surah of the Quran. And he makes this argument that unlike Christianity, which has this apocalyptic arc situated within temporality, within history, he says that for the Muslim, every moment is apocalyptic because the transformation can happen at any time. And that kind of works with me. If I'm apocalyptic, I'm like that, because I believe in the radical contingency of history as in the nature of the divine creation of the cosmos, of which we are a part. But within that cosmos, there is this superficial, if we might call it batil phenomenon, if you like, on the haqiqah. This batil phenomenon is this apocalyptic trajectory, which I suggest is the political theology informing this technocentric project. So revisiting a messianic discourse, I'm suggesting it's already there. Revisit it in the sense of like, yeah, we need to learn about it. We need to understand it. So nowadays, my thinking is what I call political economy, political ecology, political theology, and their entanglement. That we need to put all of these discourses into conversation with each other to understand what's really going on. I mean, I have a paper from I think it was 2019, published in the journal Zygon, called White Crisis and as Existential Risk, the Entangled Apocalypticism of Artificial Intelligence. So if you want to understand where I'm coming from in terms of the Messianic, the Millennialist, the Apocalyptic, you can read that paper. It's available on my academia page if anyone is having difficulty obtaining it. But for me personally, I'm not sitting around waiting for any Mahdi to come along and solve the problem. I believe in, we need to do for self, and I think that's consistent with the prophetic orientation, inshallah.
Dr. Mustafa, we have 3 more questions. Could you wrap it up? We're going to stop at 10:30. Yes, please go ahead.
Sure. Could you tell me what the questions are?
Okay, so we have here one question from Elijah. Here in the Silicon Valley, we are encouraged to attend Stanford course of creating sticky and addictive product. While this extend beyond the scope of technology, can you speak to abundance of historically colonized peoples developing technology with this framing? And what are the implications of this effort? And how might this effort become Islamic or at least decolonizing? Is it possible to develop a framework for applying this marketing effort for decolonizing aim, or is it oxymoronic? And from Istac-Iium, he said that thank you for that fascinating, enlightening talk. Actually, computing is an aspect of communication via activity of language. Can computing be decolonized? Or can it really be decolonized in isolation from other areas of activities? And the last one from Sumaya again, she said the reason for the question is that it has almost become impossible, even in the academic world, to state or defend that something is not so in the main source. Specifically, in some matters, due to the database rate of online second sources, in historical term, it is increasing. So some realities are lightly sweeping under the mats. Go ahead.
Okay, Jazakallah khair, or I should say Jazakumullah khair for those 3 brilliant questions.
Yes.
I will attempt to take them in reverse order, and I'm delighted that Elijah is on the call. I can see him in person. We get to meet virtually online, and maybe you just want to kind of unmute and we can talk it through, because I'm very interested by your question. But so let me start in reverse order. So I guess this is building on Sumaya's earlier question, and if I understand it correctly, I think what she might be talking about is that because of what I was describing earlier as the kind of network effects associated with data, that certain understandings of the world, if you like, which is describing, I think, as certain realities, are being lightly swept under the mat. I hope this is not a misunderstanding of the point she's making. I mean, maybe she wants to unmute and clarify if I am misconstruing the question. I mean, if I have understood the question or the comment correctly, I would agree. I mean, I know the context is specifically the academic world, but I would suggest that this is a more ubiquitous problem. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm not go ahead. Exactly, I'm a bit not well. That's because I cannot maybe explain it very well, but that's correct. Exactly what I mean. That your understanding is what I mean.
Oh, Jazakallah khair.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you so much for that clarification. So, yeah, I mean, I really don't know much more. I don't know what more I can add other than to say you're completely right that because of these network effects, the world is lumpy, and it's lumpy relative to dominant power. So, given that increasingly, I'm not saying exclusively, but increasingly, we are gaining our understandings of what's happening in the contemporary world, whether it's local, regional, or even international news, from online services, which are changing very, very rapidly, that we are seeing a kind of ebbing and flowing and a bobbing in the water, as it were, in the water of data, of different discourses, different interpretations of reality. And I mentioned earlier about the phenomena of filter bubbles, echo chambers, silos, and a kind of almost fracturing of spaces that, and it's largely because of network effects, and that's purposeful. Yeah, I mean, we've seen Cambridge Analytica, we've seen the deployment of Facebook by Myanmar against the Rohingya. I mean, it's being used all over the place. Why? Because of the logics which allow for this clustering, allow for these network effects. This isn't something incidental. This was what, they use very interesting kind of metaphorical language. these asymmetries of power were baked into the platforms. They're not like, oh, we throw up our hands. We didn't know this was going to happen. They knew at the very outset because it was built on a particular social psychological model of the human. I'm not saying that social psychological model is correct. I'm saying it was used. And if you want details on that, you can read something like the tome that is The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. And if you don't want to, spend half your life reading that tome, a much shorter and prior work is, I think it's called 10 Arguments for Why You Should Delete All Your Social Media Now, or something, by Jaron Lanier. I mean, I have serious problems with Lanier because he's a liberal, and I don't have too much time for liberals. But nonetheless, he called out the problems with the technology in relation to these, the embedding of social psychological models of the human in that technology. We're talking about dopamine hits, we're talking about like buttons, we're talking about, the clustering of certain phenomena around more negative kind of like characterizations of the human, et cetera, et cetera. But if you want the detail, I suggest going there. I mean, it's available on, in various formats, electronic and elsewhere. So check it out. It's by Jaron Lanier. It's a good work summarizing that. Let me jump up to Ibrahim, who I know personally, his question. So thank you for that fascinating and enlightening talk. Computing is an aspect of communication by the activity of language. I would say yes and no. I would say, for me, I tend to think about computing in cybernetic terms, and cybernetics was the study of communication and control in animals and machines. So I tend to think about computing as entangled with communication in some sense, but really about control and control in the sense of, you think about how do you get a computer to do anything? Well, you need to program it. And that is a form of control. You're controlling the behavior of the digital circuitry itself. But once you start networking computers together, they can be used to control, affect, regulate, determine, shape, mold human behavior. So that's control in the sphere of the social, if you like, or the political. So when he says that computing be decolonized, or can it really be decolonized in isolation from other areas of activity, which I guess, given where I think he's coming from, this would include politics, economics, entertainment, law, religion, sex, war, etc. My view would be we can't decolonize computing in isolation from these other areas, because computing, as I suggested, I think very early on in the talk, for me, sits at the intersection of multiple disciplines, and increasingly is a technology which is being rolled out into these other areas of activity, whether it's politics, economics, education, entertainment, healthcare, etc., etc. So, but I have a very pessimistic reading anyway. I'm suggesting, yes, computing in principle can be decolonized, but it won't be anytime soon. Why? Because it's part of a colonial project which is gathering momentum, accelerating, has a particular trajectory and orientation. And now, lastly, but not leastly, Elijah's question. Here in Silicon Valley, we are encouraged to attend Stanford's course on creating sticky and addictive products. I'd like to know what sticky is. It just shows my ignorance. I don't know what that term sticky means. While this extends beyond the scope of technology, can you speak to the abundance of historically colonized peoples developing technologies with this framing? Perhaps you can educate me about that. What are the implications of these efforts? And how might these efforts become Islamic or at least decolonizing? Another good question. Is it possible to develop a framework for applying these marketing efforts for decolonizing aims, or is it oxymoronic? About the only thing that I think I have anything marginally interesting perhaps to say in relation to that question is this term marketing, which I find terrifying. I'm currently reading a book by the former finance minister of Greece. I don't know if you can see this. No, you can't see this because of Zoom. Yanis Varoufakis, which is called Talking to My Daughter, A Brief History of Capitalism, in which he makes a very, very interesting distinction between what he calls societies with markets and market-based societies. And his argument is that, I mean, he doesn't mention the Islamic aid, but he's arguing that prior to the Industrial Revolution and the rollout of a particular model of the market, into society, into all of the social fabric by the British and the Dutch, you had societies in which there were markets, the souk, if you like, the bazaar, etc. But these societies, the market in those societies was not the center. It wasn't the, as it were, the hub or the lub of the society. But with the transition to what he calls market-based society, which is with its industrialized and racialist capitalist logic, you get a transformation of the society. So everything revolves around productionist metaphysics, the kind of thing that Marx was critiquing. And with colonialism and imperialism, boom, this just goes global. So of course there are pockets of resistance to this. There are people attempting different experiments, whether they're Marxists, Islamists, the indigenous, decolonialists, subalternists, anarchists, whatever. But the dominant hegemonic logic of the contemporary world is globalized market logic. And so, you know, when I hear about marketing, I always think about, well, isn't marketing about creating markets in a market-based world? So isn't that about essentially fitting in to the project of globalized industrial racial capitalism? And that isn't something that I want to do, but educate me, Elijah.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Jazakallah khair.
Yes.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody.
Yeah, I'm sorry,
Elijah.
actually, we are exceeding the time. I'm about actually to invite Professor Abdul Aziz before we close the session. Professor Abdul Aziz, you're welcome.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Do you hear me, Dr. Ahmed?
Yes, I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I don't have much to say, but I really admire the presentation of our Dr. Mustafa. It's great and raised a lot of important issues and showed how Muslims need a more dynamic, efficient models of understanding this phenomenon. And I think we need to further enhance this. I just mentioned to Dr. Imtiaz, if we can have a multi or transdisciplinary research group from different parts of the Malaysia here and the world at large, we can address these issues. I think that many of them are very deep issues and they need deeper understanding, analysis, and synthesis, and moving more towards practical alternatives of what need to be done. And I really thank Prof. Imtiaz for inviting our doctor. And I wish to see our doctor presenting more and more lectures along this way. And I would like to thank all these participants who are with us here, and Dr. Mira and all the other professors and doctors. This is really great, and I hope we continue this drive. May God bless you all. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdul Aziz Baragut, the Dean of Istac. And join me in thanking Dr. Syed Mustafa Ali for our talk tonight. And I want to thank you for your intellectually provocative and refreshing, I would say, presentation. And I look forward to have to listen more of your discussion. And I wish you all the best in your intellectual endeavors. You are the chosen one to lead in this area of studies, inshallah. Thank you again. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.